Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a brand new episode of Mental Health Matters. With me, your host, Mariam Helli, and joining me, as always, is our very own mental health professional, Sister Anisa Diab. Welcome to the show, Sister Anisa.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about a wide variety of social justice issues to introduce the topic of activism and mental health. Inshallah, this will be the start point for us to be able to address more specific concerns in future episodes. So we're joined today by a student, a writer, a social activist. She is a founding member of and currently sits on the board of the executive committee of the awaited Imam Mahdi Edification Association, which is AIME. It's an organisation that was established with the goal of nurturing and solidifying the sense of identity in Shia youth, particularly those living in the DC area. In her free time, she enjoys writing, travelling, and all things health and wellness related. We're honoured to have with us today our guest speaker, Sister Hidaya Nawee, to have a conversation about how to be an upstander in various circumstances within our communities. Welcome to the show, Sister Hidaya.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you for being here. It's our honor.
Sister Hidaya, if I can kickstart the show with you and just ask you to tell us a little bit about what it means to be an upstander and the methods that you utilize in your daily life to intervene or speak up.
Yeah, I think when we talk about this, what we're really talking about is the ability to use the various privileges that we enjoy in any given space. So, for example, if I am a person of color in a predominantly white space, the white person enjoys a certain amount of privilege that I do not enjoy. So it becomes their responsibility to use that in order to ensure that I'm comfortable in that space, right? So, but what we don't tend to do a lot of is realize that in any given space, you have privilege. So that looks like if you are a Shia in a predominantly Shia space, it is your responsibility to make any person who comes into that space who is not a Shia feel as comfortable as possible. So for me, that's what it's been about, using the various privileges that I enjoy to ensure that the people who might not be listened to because they don't enjoy those same privileges, that my voice is used to make sure that someone is listening.
Sister Anisa, if I can bring you in and just ask you, what kind of situations merit being an upstander?
Absolutely. I echo what the sister was saying, definitely about trying to make others feel more comfortable and have a safe space, whatever that space embodies. But yeah, upstanders, they're basically activists. They're people that, when they look at a situation and they notice something is amiss, something isn't right, they do something about it. They try to, like she was saying, make the other person more comfortable or address a problem that they might be seeing, an injustice. And there's a beautiful quote from the Holy Prophet, Hadith sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, to help your brother and also to help him whether he is the oppressor or whether he is the oppressed. So people were confused and said to the messenger, we know how to help people who are oppressed, but how do we help those who are doing the oppressing? And the Holy Prophet said, by stopping him from doing the oppressing. So we have in our Islamic tradition and the importance of being an upstander, standing for justice. And there's so many different situations that are limitless in terms of what we can do to stand up for others, whether it's, addressing bullying behavior or domestic violence, racism, Islamophobia, mental health disparities, and the stigma around that. So I think if we can do something not only to speak up, but change it with our hands, this is even better. The Holy Prophet, said that the least we can do is hate something in our heart, but the best thing we can do is to change something with our own hands. And we all tuning in here today have different capacities. We have different energy levels, different responsibilities. But I think if we can walk away from this program today asking us where we can respond to some situations that we're seeing, some injustices within our own community, because we definitely can't solve all the issues in the world, but we can control our response, at least by thinking locally and thereby making global impacts. And that's where our power lies.
Sister Hidaya, as a Shia person of colour and a social activist yourself, have there ever been any incidents or experiences that shaped your worldview and inspired you to become a vocal member of the community?
I don't think it was any one thing. I think it was definitely a combination of things. And, you know, seeing little things, or I should say things that are considered little, that are actually not little, my entire life. Whether it's, you know, racism in terms of, just as an example, people saying things like, oh, like, when did you convert to Islam? Right? Which is not inherently a bad question, right? It's not a bad question to, it's not a bad thing to have converted to Islam at all. But a lot of times when Muslims ask this question of their Black brothers and sisters, the insinuation is that Islam and Blackness are mutually exclusive, right? So you have that. And growing up, seeing, like, if we're lucky, there's one woman on the board of any given institution, and she only gets to talk about women's issues or hijab, and that's it. And usually the women's issue is hijab, and that's pretty much all she gets to do, which is, you know, obviously appalling. And seeing just how, like, convert brothers and sisters or revert brothers and sisters are treated in our communities. So I've grown up kind of seeing these sorts of microaggressions turn very, very, very ugly in some situations. So I don't think it's any, like, one instance. It was all of it that sort of came to a head, in terms of just even things outside of racism and misogyny. Like, one of the things I'm super passionate about is sort of the wealth gap, even in our Muslim communities, and the fact that we don't have systems in place to help people who are struggling financially, or at least adequate systems in place, in my opinion. So yeah, it was seeing all of those things and realizing, like, if no one's going to talk about it, I have to talk about it. Someone needs to talk about it. And a lot of times, the people who are directly affected by this, like I said, are not the ones that are listened to, right? Sister Anisa, like, obviously, I love the work that you do so much, but part of the reason I love it so much is because I grew up seeing people that I know and love struggling with, you know, mental health disorders, and being told, like, read more Quran, which I can't even, you know, really get into that. But yeah, these are things that we see every single day in our communities, and it's causing harm, right? Direct harm to a lot of people. So yeah, it was not just one event or one instance. It's all of these things.
What about you, Sister Anisa? Has there ever been a point where you felt that you've wanted to speak out against social injustice?
There have been several points, definitely, like the sister was mentioning, a culmination, but I think there was one turning point in my life where I realized this had to become part of my mission. Growing up, I was known as the quiet person in my school. People would always ask me, why are you so quiet? But my mind, there was a lot going on, and I was an observer. I had a lot of thoughts. I had a lot of big ideas, and I was a very highly sensitive child, a highly sensitive teenager. And when I would say it was when 9/11 happened that I realized things had to change, that I had to become more of a vocal person, despite the fact that I'm an introvert. I remember that day very vividly. The fear, the panic in the hallway, the parents rushing to school to pick up their kids, not knowing if there was going to be another attack occurring that day, and then going home and my mom sitting me down in the kitchen and saying, you know, from this point forward, I do not want you to open up with anybody that you are Muslim. And that was really a hard pill for me to swallow, because my faith was so important to me. And, you know, why did I have to hide something that was the whole meaning of my existence, right? So that spiraled within me this need to learn more about my deen, and not just not just learn about it, but to be able to explain to others, especially because in my school I was the only Muslim there. So in a way, I had to become a spokesperson for my faith, and I had to kind of get over this whole quietness that I had. But that was, I would say, the beginning of a long journey ahead towards speaking out and trying to do just whatever I could, even as small as it could be, to try to create an impact.
So my next question is for the both of you. What do you say to people who basically feel that they don't want to speak up because they are not experts on a particular subject matter, whether it's to do with the treatment of individuals or groups, or whether it's about Islamophobia? What would you say to them? Let's start with you, Sister Hidaya.
I think, we all have levels to our knowledge, so certainly don't speak about things beyond your scope. But I think that when it comes to injustice, there's room for all of us, right? There's no one, I can comfortably say, who can say, I don't know what bullying looks like, right? I don't know what mental health crises look like. I don't know what misogyny looks like. I don't know what racism looks like. Even if you have never directly experienced it, you know what it looks like, right? And you might be able to sort of empathize with what it might feel like as well. So we cannot stay in this bubble of, I don't know enough, and therefore I can't do, I'll do nothing, right? It's not an all or nothing game. There's room for all of us in whatever capacity that you can. Go for it, right? And maybe right now you don't know very much. That's the opportunity to educate yourself so that you do know, right? Talk to some people who are dealing with, some of the things that you have never experienced in your life. And also, crucially, believe them when they tell you what that experience is like, because that's another, epidemic in our communities. People say, like, I'm going through this, and people are like, oh, no, you're not. You're fine, right? So when you do hear the experiences from people, believe it, right? And so that can be the first step to learning and growing as a person, and also surrounding yourself with a diverse group of people so that you're not getting one side of the story all of the time.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sister was saying. And I've always said, especially to non-Muslims, if you don't know the answer to something, please ask me. Please, how else are people going to know if they don't ask you questions? So, I do respect that not everybody is going to feel like they're an expert in a certain subject matter. And sometimes it's not appropriate for a certain individual to be talking about something. Like, I wouldn't expect somebody who grew up in Malaysia their whole life to talk about what it's like to grow up during 9/11 as an American Muslim. That would just be inappropriate and insensitive, regardless of how many books or videos this person has read, right? But I'm seeing this trend right now where people are like, I shouldn't have to be a spokesperson, and I'm not an expert, and kind of getting defensive when people ask questions. And I really want, again, this is just my opinion, but I really want to challenge that a little bit, because we need to educate ourselves. Like, I think sometimes that statement can be a cop-out, that I don't want to go do my research. I don't want to figure out what the real answer is. I don't have time for that. So I'm just not going to answer the question. And that's just, to me, it's not acceptable. We can do better as a community. Everybody has to start from somewhere. Nobody starts out as an expert. And the beauty is, like, that you don't have to know everything. It's also okay to say to this person, listen, I don't know why you need 2 female witnesses for every male witness or whatever. I know Islam looks at women and men as equals, but I'm not really sure the rationale behind that. Can I get back to you with the answer? Can I consult with somebody else? And I can tell you, every time I've had that experience, the person is so just grateful that I'm taking the time to find the right answer instead of just guessing and giving them the wrong answer. So I really think it's important, it's incumbent upon us to educate ourselves. And when you teach other people, that's how you become an expert, because what you convey to others, that becomes ingrained. That's when you really do the full-on learning. So I think we have to get out of that mentality.
Just to quickly add, I think if you really don't know, pass the mic to someone who does.
Exactly.
Right? And that's also a form of using your privilege. It's completely fine to not know something, but you know someone who does. So give them the arena in order to have them tell the story in a way that will do justice to whatever it is that you're trying to get accomplished.
And I think that's also, you make a great point, and that starts with the need of, at our events, whether we're having a panel or some kind of event, making sure that we're diversifying who is present. One thing that annoys me is when I just get asked to do speaking engagements when it's, the anniversary of Lady Zainab's birth, or, certain women related events. And we have more to say than just on those occasions. And people of color need to be at the table, not just in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. They need to be at the table in every event, because you make a great point that we're missing those narratives and we can't speak for those people's experiences. So I think that's critical, that we begin to have more of an open lens in our event planning, in the structure, what that looks like, starting from our communities, starting from the masjid administration, and having, a diversified panel of individuals. It's really crucial moving forward.
Thank you, sisters. Sister Anisa, if I can come to you again. Sister Hidaya previously mentioned briefly about microaggression. Could you just give us a bit more detail or information about what microaggression is and what our role in the community is in addressing those instances?
Yeah, microaggressions, they are these subtle, intentional, but oftentimes, very imperceptive biases that people convey. And I remember after 9/11, I put hijab on 2 years later. And the biggest microaggression, I didn't realize what it was called at the time. I didn't realize it was called a microaggression, but the biggest questions I would get asked all the time are, where are you from? Where are you from? Are like random strangers in the elevator would ask me, are you imported? And I was just like, why almost? I mean, before I wore hijab, nobody was asking me where I was from all the time, but there was this implication that I was somehow an alien in my own country, in my own land, despite that my family goes back very far, in the United States. I mean, my grandfather is Christian, fought in World War II. Our families have been in this country for generations. So I think that when a lot of times we think of bullying as very direct, very open, like, go back to your old country or wherever you came from. But a lot of times it's these many moments when we get asked these questions. So I think it's really important to have some microaggression interrupters in your repertoire of responses. So you can say something like, if somebody asks you that question, where are you from all the time? What's making you ask me that question? Can you help me understand what makes you ask me that? And a lot of times people will say, well, it's, the scarf on your head. And then that gives you an opportunity to explain your faith and say, you might be interested, you may not realize this, but just because somebody wears a headscarf, a hijab, doesn't mean that they're from somewhere else. This is a representation of faith, not a representation of cultural belonging. And then that gives you an opportunity for further dialogue. But I think even more so, there's situations we come across where, the things are being said that just aren't right. And you need to be able to speak up, right, for those individuals. For example, if somebody says, Black people are lazy, astaghfirullah, you have to speak up in those moments and say, hey, that's not okay with me. Or I find that offensive that you've said that. And that's an opportunity where you can help the person doing the oppressing.
We're currently living in very difficult times with a global pandemic and also polarization of various groups of society. Sister Hidaya, if I can bring you in and just ask you what you think some of the current trends are that you're seeing that you think are quite concerning when it comes to social justice issues.
Yeah, I think, one of the main ones Sister Anisa alluded to earlier, which is this idea that I don't want to be a spokesperson. It is not my job to be a social justice activist. And so people don't want the, I guess, pressures that could come with being the person who stands up for something. But just like her, I would like to challenge that by saying that's the prophetic model, right? To just be really blunt, most of the reason that the prophet came and also that the imam is going to come is to liberate people from these sorts of issues that we have in our community. So much so that it says he's going to come back with something that looks like a different religion to us, right? Which is very scary. But I think the other thing as well is this idea that if it's not happening to me or not happening where I can see it, then it's not happening, which is so, it's so far removed from, again, the prophetic model of if you go to sleep without thinking about what your fellow Muslim is going through, you might not even really be Muslim, to put it bluntly, because, it's our responsibility to take care of one another. Islam says that your neighbor is 40 houses on each side of you, right? So we need to think about these things and go back in a very, very, very big way to the way that the prophet handled things and the way that he saw things, because it is our responsibility to help one another. It is absolutely, if I, for instance, I'm struggling with something and someone else has the skill to help me with that, it's your responsibility to help me, right? And to help also in a way that will actually be beneficial to me. You can't help me the way you think I need to be helped as well, which is another thing that I'm saying. It's like, oh, we'll go, we haven't done this in a while, so we'll go feed the homeless, but we'll bring food that they're not familiar with at all, and then get mad at them for not wanting to eat the food that they don't know anything about, right? When the real problem is, even though it's really noble to feed people, you still need to sit with them. What do they like? We don't know. So we just bring the things that we like and project it on them, which, is horrible. Think about that happening to you. So yeah, those are some of the things that I see and I have been seeing consistently. But alhamdulillah, also at the same time, seeing a lot of pushback from the Muslim community very recently. There's been a lot of, very uncomfortable conversations being had, which is sort of, I love that so much because uncomfortable conversations allow for growth.
And if you could change one thing about the conversations around race in the Muslim community, what would that be and how can we be part of the solution?
Wow, that is so multifaceted. Honestly, we can do a whole show just on that one question. But I think that, again, the crux of this for me is going back to how the prophet did things. He is our role model for a reason, right? And honestly, a lot of his solutions to a lot of these problems are very simple. To me, activism in any sphere comes down to one thing. We want you to keep the same energy, as the kids would say, in everything that we do. So if you don't assume that a person who looks like you and shares this masjid with you, this predominantly, whatever you want to call it, Iraqi, Irani masjid, right? If an Iranian walks in and you don't assume that they're stealing, then don't follow the convert around and assume that they're stealing, right? Which is a real example, by the way. that actually happened. So yeah, that's what needs to happen. A lot of the very, very, very basic courtesies that you would extend to everyone that you know that looks like you, extend that to everyone. If someone shows up in our space and they tell you that they're Muslim, believe them. Believe them. And if you don't know them, go out of your way to know that person. There's a reason that when the Prophet came to Medina, the first thing he did was establish what was essentially a buddy system, right? And it was someone who was new with someone who was not, right? So in every sphere, they can help each other. We need that in our communities. There's a reason that the Prophet didn't have this, oh, I don't talk to women that I'm not married to, which I have a lot of questions about. If I'm a scholar, like I don't answer questions from women. Like have her brother send me the question, which is also a real example. All of these things, like we don't see the Prophet doing that. We don't see the Prophet having any kind of tolerance for the Asabiyya of the Arabs at all, right? And he was one of them as well. So yeah, that is what needs to change. That's what needs to shift. A lot of the very basic things that you extend to those that you know and love, do that for everybody across the board in any given situation.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with our sister. And Anisa, what would you say are the psychological effects on individuals who have been through bullying or have experienced any discrimination?
Oh, huge. I mean, there are big psychological effects. And that's why whenever I'm doing an intake with a new client, one of the things, the questions that I ask is to talk to me about instances of bullying in grade school or at home or in the workplace if they're dealing with any kind of Islamophobia, because that gives me a good picture of how those situations might be impacting their mental health. And we know based on research that those who experience bullying or discrimination, they're at increased risk for developing depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts. So bullying is a huge risk factor for that. And I think, we call bullying by fancy names today. We call it discrimination, we call it harassment, stalking, emotional abuse, narcissism, domestic violence, but it's all bullying at the end of the day. It's all under that umbrella. And, I can say that it's especially detrimental when young people who are being bullied see inaction by their peers or their friend group. I remember one client I worked with who, he had not just been bullied by one person, but slandered by this one person, and the entire class was in on it and in on who had slandered him and wrote this awful graffiti in the bathroom. And he would cry every day at school. And until now, into adulthood, there's so much built up anger and so much distrust of friends and who one can trust. So these situations have a huge psychological impact. And at the end of the day, as Dr. Martin Luther King, says, it won't be the words of our enemies, but the inaction of our friends that will hurt the most. It'll be the silence of our friends.
Thank you. And Sister Hidaya, how does bystander intervention relate to spiritual reformation in our communities, both on an individual level and on a systematic level?
I mean, I think both of those things are interlinked. I sort of alluded to this earlier, but all of that, you cannot be a well-rounded Muslim if you are not on some level also a social justice activist. It's not possible, especially living in the world today, waiting for the Imam who is going to come and establish justice in the world. You cannot be, there's no such thing as just, a casual observer of these things. These things are interwoven into our spirituality. on a personal level and also on a systemic level. On a systemic level, it looks like, again, using your privilege. If you're the president of whatever organization or whatever center, you have a huge responsibility to make sure that every single person who comes into that space is not discriminated against, right? There's a reason we have all of these stories that the imams model themselves after the poorest people in their communities, right? So why does the imam do that, right? It's because we don't want to be in a position where the most disenfranchised person in the community sees the leader and thinks of them as unapproachable for anything, right? Because we don't have this sort of monarchy and hierarchical system in Islam at all. At the end of the day, what differentiates us, as the Quran and Ahlulbayt alayhim salam say over and over and over and over again, is taqwa, right? And a huge part of being able to attain taqwa is the ability to help out those of us or those who are not at the same level as you, whether that's spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, all of that. We all have a role to play here, and it's absolutely impossible to be a well-rounded, and whatever you think of as a good Muslim, it's not possible to be a good Muslim without having these sorts of things in place. It's everyone's responsibility. We don't get to say, oh, well, I'm this or that, and therefore I have no power. In certain situations, we all have some level of power. If you're a man in the Muslim community, you have power, okay? If you are from whatever Middle Eastern country, you have power, because a lot of times Islam is defined by you, right? And the people who are from the Middle East, even though the vast majority of Muslims are not Middle Easterners. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, we all have a certain level of privilege. If you are not a person of color, you have a huge amount of privilege, right? So it's all of our responsibility. No one can get to say, oh, I'm just going to focus on me and be a good Muslim for me and not help anybody else. It's not possible. You cannot separate the two.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you, sister. And if I come to you again, Sister Anisa, what should someone do if they hear or if they see a person in authority abusing their power and mistreating someone from a minority group?
This is a great question. And I think that, like Sister was saying, certain individuals have a certain level of power and privilege that others do not have. And we have to be cognizant of that. But I also believe that a lot of times, in order to end any kind of abuse, in my experience, it usually will not end until that person is held accountable by another person who somehow has more authority than they do. And I want to give an example, of this. There was, a story of actually a friend of mine where she turned 16. She had passed her driver's ed, all the requirements for that. And she was standing in line to get a photo taken for her driver's license. And this particular motor vehicle, building, this particular organization said, you have to take your hijab off. We're not going to let you take your photo unless you remove it. And this is a public security issue. Now this was back in 2010. And she started crying and she said, no, I'm not going to remove it. And, this became a big scene. And everybody in the situation, not a single person stood up for her. And in fact, the opposite, somebody actually yelled to her, go back to Afghanistan. She wasn't even from Afghanistan. And anyway, it was rude, disgusting comment to shout at anyone to begin with. But what she did was what's key, because some people in that situation might say, well, I don't have any power here. I need my driver's license. Let me just take my hijab off. But she didn't. She contacted the Council on American Islamic Relations, here in the US, and they're made up of lawyers and civil rights individuals. And it just took one phone call to this motor vehicle administration, just one phone call. We understand that you are not allowing so-and-so to have their photo taken. This is unconstitutional, and we are going to take legal action against you if you do not permit her to get her driver's license taken with her hijab on. Oh, they were quick to issue an apology. Very, very quick on that. So we have more power than we think. Sometimes we grow up with certain messages from others that, we don't have, what can you do? You just have to go with what they're asking you. Or in school, one thing that bothered me that teachers would say growing up is just ignore this person. If they're saying something bad to you, just ignore it. As if it's gonna go away, right? So I think that we can't be afraid to advocate for ourselves, and if we're not sure who to turn to do our research, because we have way more rights than we think, and we definitely have a responsibility in these situations to stand up. And I'm sure the next person who walks in the door will appreciate that you set that way for them to have less trouble down the road.
Thank you. And finally, Sister Hidaya, in what ways can we grow in our communities when it comes to gender issues and misogyny?
Listen to the women. That's it. It's really that simple. Listen to the women and believe them. Believe that their experiences are always going to be different from yours. Believe that their needs in the community is going to be different from your own. And also pass the mic, on a lot of these things. It's funny because, in preparing for this, I was thinking about something that happened years ago, which I still remember seeing a flyer for this event, and it was all about justice in Islam, and there were 4 men on the panel and no women. And I was like, wow, that's interesting, right? Like, why are we talking about justice in Islam without the female perspective, right? These are the same people, and no shame to anybody who participated in that, or maybe a little, but these are the same people that get on Manabir and tell us all about the fact that Sayyidah Zahra went up and fought for her rights, right? And that the only reason we have the stories of Imam Hussein alayhi salam is because of the women, right? And yet are perfectly comfortable excluding what women's perspectives are, right? And I also remember was listening to something, same sort of idea. It was a panel. This time there was one woman on the panel. And I remember one of the men was like, oh, our centers are so receptive to new ideas. They always allow you to do things. All you have to do is find someone and talk to them, right? And all the men were kind of just nodding along and agreeing. And the woman was like, wait, hold on, where are these centers that are doing this, that are inclusive and that are willing to listen? Because that's not my experience. And I'm so glad she said that, because it's not a lot of people's experience, right? A lot of times women are the afterthought. We're the ones who drive an hour to the masjid just to watch the speaker on a screen. Like, why? We're the ones who have to pray in broom closets because there's not enough room, because there are too many men, right? So all of these things were not acceptable during the prophets or any of the imams' times, right? When we talk about, equality and all of that, that's a huge topic in and of itself. But equality does not look like me driving an hour to the masjid just to watch the speaker on a screen. That's not what that looks like. Yes, okay, there's room in the masjid, but why, if I drove there with my brother, for example, why does he get more access to the speaker than I do? Right? Why? Why is it that we tell women that they are the teachers of the next generation and we deprive them of time with the scholars in our communities? Why is it that our scholars, our centers don't want to invite the few women who are actually experts in certain things to talk about those same things? But we're entirely comfortable inviting a man who knows almost nothing, and that's fine, and we're willing willing to give that person a platform. So yeah, that's where we need to start, is listening to the concerns, making sure that we make room for the women in our communities and treat them as a priority instead of just an afterthought.
And in my final question today, and just to conclude this episode about being an upstander in the community, if I can come to you first, Sister Anisa, what advice would you give to someone who wants to become an upstander in the community?
I think first of all, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to put yourself in experiences where you are the other and you're having to learn about the differences in your beliefs and values and, you know, getting into the mindset of others and putting yourself in uncomfortable settings. I think that is the first start. And then I think second, you know, having some kind of mission statement for your life, some kind of social justice issue that you want to dedicate yourself to. I mean, for me, that has been Islamophobia, it has been mental health, and I try to support, you know, other organizations and activists, you know, in terms of their work that they're doing, but find something that is very special to you and that speaks to you in terms of a problem that you want to solve in the world, and be persistent and let that be part of your long-term vision, inshallah, to address that issue and to solve the problems around that in whatever way you can with the gifts that you have.
And Sister Hidaya?
Absolutely. I echo everything that she has just said. And in order not to be repetitive, I'm just going to add one thing to that, which is that activism and being an upstander does not always look like this, right? It does not look like getting on a panel and talking for an hour, right? We do that, and it's important to do that. It's important for, you know, platforms to have these conversations, but being an activist also looks like picking up a book. It also looks like educating yourself so that you can educate your children, right? Which is the hardest job in the world, right? It looks like checking your family members when they say or do things that are inappropriate in any given setting, right? It looks like checking yourself and realizing, like, okay, there might have been instances in my own life where I did this or that wasn't the correct way to go about it. It looks like apologizing to people who you've wronged and promising to do better and following through on that. So again, like, I completely agree with everything that Sister Anisa has just said, but even if all you can do, and I don't think this is all anyone can do, but even if for the time being you feel as though the only person that you have control over is yourself, then there is room for you to do that with yourself, by yourself, or even just with your immediate family members. It doesn't have to be, you know, a global issue right off the bat. It can just be myself, my family, my community. And then we can talk about the world.
Sister Anisa and Sister Hidaya, you've both given us so much to think about, so thank you so much. And dear viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time, inshallah. Take care. Ma'as salama.